Look at the events you've written down. Is it real to you that the conclusion you reached, people aren't interested in what I have to say, is a valid interpretation of those events? Can you agree that virtually any child at that age and in those situations would have reached a similar conclusion? Now we're going to play the possibilities game. Well, imagine that 4 friends of yours are visiting you and looking at a videotape of the events you just wrote down. Your interpretation of those events when you were a child was, people aren't interested in what I have to say. That is one valid interpretation of Mom and Dad's behavior. That interpretation wasn't wrong, but there are other reasonable interpretations of the same childhood events that you didn't think of as a child. So let's ask each of your friends for another alternative interpretation. Can you see that one friend might well say, maybe Mom and Dad weren't interested in what you had to say, but that doesn't necessarily mean no one would be interested? Couldn't the events in your childhood be explained by this interpretation, just as well as your interpretation, that people aren't interested in what I have to say? Here's what your second friend says. Maybe people weren't interested in what you had to say as a child. That doesn't mean they never will. Doesn't this interpretation also explain those events in your childhood just as well as your interpretation, that people aren't interested in what I have to say? Here's a third possible interpretation of your childhood events that one of your friends suggests. Maybe Mom and Dad were interested in what you had to say. Their behavior was due to having a lot on their minds most of the time. Doesn't this interpretation also explain those events in your childhood just as well as your interpretation, that people aren't interested in what I have to say? Here's another interpretation from your fourth friend. Your parents didn't listen to you because they had poor parenting skills. They just didn't realize the effect of their not listening. It wasn't because people aren't interested in what I have to say. Couldn't any one of these interpretations explain your childhood interactions with your parents just as well as your interpretation? People aren't interested in what I have to say? Of course they can. So is it real to you that a belief you've lived with almost your entire life, something you thought was a fact, is not a fact, isn't the truth at all? It's only a truth, merely one interpretation of many possible interpretations of earlier events, right? With a little help from me and your friends, you can see that not being able to impact your life as a child could have at least 4 different reasonable interpretations or meanings. Do you remember what you wrote down a few minutes ago as the source of your belief, people aren't interested in what I have to say? Look at the text box below on your screen. Right now, imagine seeing what you saw then and hearing what you heard then. Take a few minutes and really imagine the events of your childhood that led you to forming the belief, people aren't interested in what I have to say. Didn't it seem when you were a child as if you could actually see people aren't interested in what I have to say in those early events with your parents? It did, didn't it? You may have the sense that you didn't see the belief, you felt it. Once you formed the belief people aren't interested in what I have to say, you probably did feel it. I'll get back to the feeling in a minute, but what I'd like you to focus on now is not the feeling, but on my question. When your parents didn't pay attention to you, didn't it seem as if you saw people aren't interested in what I have to say? As if you could point to it? As if you could have said to me, Morty, can't you see people aren't interested in what I have to say? I didn't hear you. Did you say yes? Now that you think you saw people aren't interested in what I have to say as a child, I'd like you to look again. Did you really see people aren't interested in what I have to say? If you did, what does people aren't interested in what I have to say look like? Could you really point to it? Does people aren't interested in what I have to say have a color, a shape, location? Is it real to you now that you saw events, but never really did see people aren't interested in what I have to say? If anything you can really see can be described, And if you can't describe what people aren't interested in what I have to say looks like, is it clear now that you never really saw it? Since you never really saw people aren't interested in what I have to say, what did you actually see? Is it clear now that all you really saw was your parents not paying attention to you when you wanted their attention? In other words, all you really saw was a series of events? What happened was that you looked at a series of events that can be interpreted in many different ways. You gave the events one meaning, which was, people aren't interested in what I have to say. By attributing that specific meaning to the events, each time your parents didn't listen to what you had to say, it was as if you could see that meaning in those situations. But you didn't discover the meaning in the events, you gave the meaning to the events. They had no meaning before you created one. Is it real now that the events had no meaning until you gave one to them? Here's another way to understand that events have no inherent meaning. What if I told you that my parents never listened to me when I was little? Aside from that piece of information, do you know anything else for sure about how people will treat me as an adult? Does it mean no one would ever be interested in what I have to say, or even that my parents weren't interested? Is it clear you wouldn't know anything about me, and you don't know anything about how people will treat you as an adult either? All you know for sure is what actually happened. You didn't get your parents' attention a lot of the time. And finally, if you never saw people aren't interested in what I have to say out there in the world, where's it been all these years? Did I hear you say that people aren't interested in what I have to say has only ever existed in your mind? That you never did see it out there in the world? That's right. Now, if the belief is more real to you as a feeling than as a concept, here's another way to look at it. Didn't it seem as if your parents' behavior and comments when you were a child made you feel people aren't interested in what I have to say? But you just agreed that the events have no meaning. Is it possible for events that have no meaning to make you feel people aren't interested in what I have to say, or anything else for that matter? Of course not. So frequently not getting heard as a child couldn't have made you feel people aren't interested in what I have to say. What did make you feel that? By now I think you know the answer to that question. Please answer out loud. That's right. You felt that only because that's the meaning you already had given to frequently not getting heard. Let me help you make this real. Imagine that I had been there when you were a little child, and it helped you realize there were alternative interpretations. And after that conversation you concluded, maybe Mom and Dad aren't interested in what I had to say, but that doesn't necessarily mean no one would be interested. Here's what I'd like you to do now. Take a moment and really imagine being a child and being unable to get Mom and Dad to listen to you. As you imagine the events, apply this different interpretation to their behavior. Notice how it feels to be a child who's thinking, maybe Mom and Dad aren't interested in what I had to say, but that doesn't necessarily mean no one would be interested. You can use the pause button below to pause the video while you make these childhood scenarios more real for yourself. When you're done imagining, press the play button. As you imagine this scene, does it still feel like your parents' words and actions are making you feel people aren't interested in what I have to say? Probably not. And if you didn't feel people aren't interested in what I have to say then, would you feel it now? Again, the answer is no. So Mom and Dad's behavior never caused you to feel people aren't interested in what I have to say. That feeling came from your interpretation of their behavior. And since your feelings were not caused by events in reality, they were only the result of a meaning you made up to explain the events, is it real that the feelings you had when you couldn't get your parents' attention as a child didn't tell you anything at all about whether other people will be interested in what you have to say as an adult? They didn't, did they? Okay, now take a deep breath, let it out slowly, and then say out loud, people aren't interested in what I have to say. Is it the truth? Does it still feel like the truth? Your answer is very important here. Take another deep breath and say, people aren't interested in what I have to say out loud. I bet it feels very different when you say these words now than when you said them at the beginning of this exercise. Do these words feel true, even a little bit? Unless the belief is 100% gone and the words don't feel true at all, you probably still have the belief. Remember, holding a belief is like being pregnant. You either is or you ain't. There's no sort of. If the belief is still there, it probably still seems like you saw it. Once it no longer seems as if you saw people aren't interested in what I have to say in those early events, the belief will be gone. So please click the repeat button to repeat that step of the process. If the belief is gone, please click continue.